Hello, my name is Antoni Napieralski and I'm University Assistant at the Institute for Innovation and Digitalization in Law. And today we're going to talk about European Union law. I'm going to give you a brief introduction to the topic so that it'll be easier for you during the lecture to understand what we're going to be talking about. To begin with, we need to ask a question what the European Union actually is. And in order to fully understand this concept, we need to introduce two principles. The first one, the principle of EU being a supranational organization. What does it mean? Well, contrary to classical international law, EU has some characteristics that are unique for it. First of all, when we're talking about the EU, we talk about supremacy of EU law. What does it mean? Well, it means that every time there is a conflict, a collision of norms between norms that come from the EU and norms that come from the national legal systems, the first one, the EU norms, would prevail. That's one thing to remember. Second thing is direct applicability of EU law. Again, what does it mean? It means that under specific circumstances, the EU has the power to grant rights or impose duties directly on people living on the territory of the EU. And it does not have to involve national parliaments or governments. What is also important to remember when talking about the EU is that it does not have something that's called in the literature competence. It means that the EU cannot on its own decide what's the scope of its competences, what is the scope of its authority. That's something that can only be decided by the member states and was done in the treaties. Currently, we have 28 member states in the EU, which obviously will soon change due to the Brexit. And since we have so many member states in the EU, we also have quite a few languages, that is 24 languages. To begin with, I would like to introduce some EU institutions to you. Here, you have a list of the most important European institutions. Today, we're not going to talk about all of them, only the most important ones. We're not going to talk about the European Central Bank or the European Court of Auditors. But before we move further, there's one other important remark that needs to be made. There is no separation of powers in the EU. It means that, contrary to what you might be used to when looking at national legal systems, there is no division between judiciary, executive, and legislative. It is a bit more complicated on the EU level, as you will soon see, but that's just something that needs to be remembered by you. Here you have four institutions that we're going to begin with. The first one is the European Council. What it is? It's a body that consists of heads of states of the member states. That is either presidents or prime ministers. They meet at least 4 times a year and they set out general political directions of union's development. So they decide the most important and also the most general cases that are vital to the EU at the moment. Currently, the president of the European Council is Mr. Donald Tusk, the former Polish Prime Minister. Next institution we're going to talk about is European Commission. Sometimes it is being referred to as the European government, although that is not exactly the correct term. It is a bit more complicated than that. First important function of the European Commission is that it is the only body in the EU that has the power to submit legislative proposals. What does it mean? Every time a new piece of legislation in the EU is enacted, you can always trace it back to the European Commission. They are the ones that draft the first proposal and then submit it to other institutions. So actually they have a great power on deciding which matters would be regulated by the EU and which not. Another function of the European Commission is so-called guardian of the treaties. The European Commission has the duty to observe political or legal developments in the member states, and every time they have a suspicion that one of the member states might be in breach of a treaty, they have special procedures that can be then enacted that in the end could also lead to a trial in front of the Court of Justice, where on one side would be the European Commission, on the other side would be a member state. The European Commission has also some competences in the area of competition law. It's also important to remember that it consists of 28 commissioners, one for each member state, but they do not represent interests of the member states. They are obliged by the treaties to represent the interests of the whole Union. Currently, the President of the European Commission is Jean-Claude Juncker, the former Prime Minister from Luxembourg. Another institution I would like to talk to you about is the Council, with its full name Council of the EU. So please do not mix up these two, because there are two completely different bodies with different competences. The Council has its major role in the legislative procedure, in the so-called ordinary legislative procedure, which is one of the few legislative procedures in the EU. The Council and the European Parliament are equal. What does it mean? They have exactly the same powers when it comes to approving, amending, or rejecting proposals that come from the Commission. In the Council of the EU, we have something that's called presidency, which is a rotating presidency. Every 6 months, a different member state holds the presidency. Currently, it's Austria, which means that Austria is responsible for coordinating the works of the Council. And the last institution on this slide is the European Parliament. It is interesting and important for us because it's the only body that is directly elected by the European citizens, by the people who live in the EU. It consists of 751 members of the European Parliament, with currently the President Antonio Tajani. And as said before, its most important function is in the area of legislation, where it is equal to the Council. Before we move on, one thing to remember, we have quite a few councils in Europe. On the left side, you see institutions of the European Union, European Council and Council of the EU. On the right side, you see something that's called Council of Europe. That's not part of the European Union. That's not an institution of the European Union. It's a completely different international organization with its main focus on protection of human rights. So please remember that and do not mix these institutions up. The last institution I would like to talk to you about today is the Court of Justice of the EU. Its main function is to ensure that the interpretation and application of law in the EU would not be in a breach of treaties, and it would be unified throughout the whole Union. It has its seat in Luxembourg and is sometimes referred to as the motor of European integration. The reason for that is that the Court of Justice, throughout the last 30 or 40 years, has issued a number of judgments that granted rights directly to the European citizens, to the people living in the EU. Because if you think about the whole project of European integration, at the very beginning, it was purely a project focused on economic cooperation. And then, mainly because of the judgments of the Court of Justice, it started to transform into the direction where it is not only an economical community, but also a community that first grants, then respects and protects rights of the people living in the EU. The jurisdiction of the Court of Justice is defined in the Treaty on Functioning of the EU. Here you have the list of areas in which the court has the power to issue judgments. The most important for us would be the last one, preliminary rulings. What does it mean? Every time a case is being decided by a national court in the member state, and there are doubts regarding how the European law should be interpreted, then depending on the circumstances, the national court either can or have to ask the Court of Justice in Luxembourg on how a specific matter, a specific provision of a part of European law should be interpreted. And this preliminary ruling is then binding for the national court. That's one of the most powerful tools of the Court of Justice, oriented and at unifying interpretation of European law throughout the whole EU. Another important competence of the Court of Justice is, for example, issuing judgments where the member states infringed EU law, especially the treaties. So, as I said before, since the Commission is seen as the guardian of the treaties, they can bring up the case to the Court of Justice where the member state would be put on trial regarding a possible breach of treaties. Again, watch out. There are two international courts in Europe. The one of them, on the left side, is the Court of Justice of the EU, the one we just talked about. Here are some of its competences. It has a seat in Luxembourg. On the right side, you have the European Court of Human Rights. It is an institution of the Council of Europe, that is this international organization focused on protection of human rights. It has its seat in Strasbourg, and it's dealing with individual claims of people who think that their rights might have been infringed. Thank you for your attention. That was the introduction to EU law.